Thank you, everyone, for tuning into another episode of the War Report, and we are back, and we have quite a bit to cover. I'm sorry, we had a little bit of delay starting. I know this is pre-recorded, so it's not going to make a difference either way. But GSP was being very unoptical off air, so we needed to set him straight on that because there's a lot of controversial topics that we're going to be covering in this episode. Of course, we need to talk about how Putin is going down to what's his name, Danikov. That's the new guy, and
Yeah.
how all the shenanigans at the polls, because we know every Russian polling station has to have a coat of arms on it. All the voting boxes have to have a coat of arms on it. Little flags everywhere. This is just what the Russian polling stations look
Yeah,
like.
they all look like that.
This is something straight out of 1930s propaganda, and this just proves what Putin is doing is wrong and standing in elections. And you know what? As a result of this, I need to throw down and I need to say that we need Slutsky to win. We need some base nationalism. I mean, look, I kid, but the Russian elections are always so fun for the exact opposite reasons that you would expect. I love watching the race for second place. I'm not gonna lie, it's a very fun process, and I think it's also very telling about who comes in second place, where the Russian elector is at, because of course Putin's gonna win. I'm not even alleging fraudulence. I'm just saying, just because of the way the government and the ruling party is set up there, it just lends itself to that, and like it's we could get into more detail about that, but that's not really relevant. But and I'll talk about, of course, more in detail when we actually get through some more Ukraine stuff, which we'll get to in just a second here. But in all seriousness, I do think that the second place winner does indicate the direction of the Russian public, despite the fact that a lot of these are just figurehead candidates, and the opposition. While I suppose you could say just controlled opposition, if you want to be very blunt and simplistic about it, I mean, there's a general political culture, general political understanding among the ruling. I mean, this happens in every country. Don't get me wrong, but I do want to touch a little bit on some of the second party candidates, in an actual serious sense, and not just making fun of them. But without further ado, I'll let you get into more substantial Ukraine news.
Yes. So, what I was thinking is I'll begin with the maps and then I'll move on to strikes because there have been a lot of strikes behind enemy lines by both sides. So, with no further ado, then you can post the first map I sent you, and that's the situation as of today in the Bakhmut, in the Robotina area. And you can see that um, the Russians, compared to last week, are little by little gaining more territory. They have completely pushed out the Ukrainians from the area of Verbove, which is on the other side of Rabotino. Now, if you post the second map now, it is a day before the most recent gains that the first map showed, but it's better because it shows where all the defensive lines are, where all the earthworks that both sides have had in the conflict, and you can see kind of like what the Russians are doing. So they're moving from the north, and I think what they're trying to do is cut off the Ukrainians who are still holding in the south. And in the south, you can see that after a lot of brutal fighting by both sides, the Russians have managed to get a very decent foothold. They've in the southern part of Robotino and on the west side of Robotino, you can see that they've captured those defensive lines. These are the more deeper trenches. They've been there for a while. Um, Remember that the Russians. This is the third time they've moved into this area and have yet to be pushed back. So they've been in this area now for over 48 hours. It could be that the Ukrainians might not have what it takes because they are dumping as many troops as they can in Avdiivka. We'll get to Avdiivka, but It is in Avdiivka where a lot of the fighting is going on. The Ukrainians, maybe because they don't want to lose this line, even though it's not as well fortified as the lines behind it. It could be that it could be for PR purposes. They don't want to lose it. For whatever reasons, I would say that some of the Russian gains here have to do with the Ukrainians are just finding it too difficult to hold on to Rabotino. So um, that whole salient that reached down in the south is gone now. Like I said, Verbove is secure, and the Russians are making headway in the north. If they keep doing that, and there's not many fortifications, although it is an open field, and that's always difficult to attack, right? You leave yourself quite open. It could be that this area doesn't have maybe as much priority. That isn't to say it has no priority. That's okay. I want to stress that. I would say of the let's say four most important battles on the front line, Robotino is still one of them. It's just not number one or two anymore, is what I'm saying. So that's Rabotino. Now, during the week, if we go to slide number 3, this is on the outskirts of Donetsk, outside of Pesky. And I believe, I think Pervomayske. So, yeah, so this is slide number 3. The Russians captured a stronghold that's on heights. It's a small place. It's a tiny village called Nevelske, and they captured it. Do you see the gray outlines represent recent captures that are not on the same day. This map is from Friday, so they would have captured these areas probably Wednesday of this week. And I'm going to go to the fourth map, and that's a blow up, and that will give you an idea of the fortifications around there. You can see there's a few. There's not that many, but the most important ones are captured by the Russians. And this too is creating. When you look at Pervomayske, you're seeing that there are Ukrainians that are getting trapped. Their salient is getting thin, and so the Russians are going around the flanks in order to cut them off instead of fighting them head on. This isn't something they could do as easily when they were fighting for Marinka or Pesky back in 2022, but they are doing that now. Probably a good reason for that is there have been a lot of successful hits by the Russians on NASAM systems. So we covered them a little bit last week when we talked about the Patriot missile system that was destroyed. There were at least 2 Patriot systems that were destroyed together. Now, the Turks claim that there were actually 3, and that the third battery that was destroyed was not an S-300. I don't know. I'm not an expert. I can't tell them apart. But three battery anti-air defense systems were destroyed. At least 2 of those were Patriot systems, and that might be all the Patriot systems. There was another NASAM that was destroyed as well, and another S-300 since the last show. So I think obviously the Russians are using the Air Force a lot more than they were before. There was an interesting, I'll show it later when we get to Avdiivka, but that Jihad Julian posted. And so now, if we go to the 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th slide from the top, you're going to see the gains that the Russians have made around Pervomayske, which is it's a pretty big area, all things considered. Okay. So what they did is they went around this lake and they basically forced the Ukrainians to retreat from the east because they were in danger of being cut off. There's another section of this front where they did the same thing on the road to Pervomaisky, where there's another, it's not a waterworks, it's some kind of a small lake. I don't think it's man-made. So the next slide is below this one of Pervomaisky is Bakhmut, and the front has stalled there a little bit. The Russians have made some gains around Ivanivske, and to the north, Bogdanovka. But they're not huge. But this is, I suppose, as I said on the show last week, if they captured Chasiv Yar, that's the highest area in this whole region. And then those chain of towns that begins with Konstantinovka, goes to Kramatorsk, to Slavyansk, all those are in the valley. So here's a blow. The slide next to beneath Bakhmut is a blow up of Bogdanivka that you can see. That's essentially opposite of Chasiv Yar. So this is a territory that the Russians have never had since the start of the war. And then if you go to the slide below it, is also in the Bakhmut direction, beneath, south of Bogdanovka is Ivanivsky. And the Russians have at least 55% of this town. They haven't been able to press that much further. I don't know if there's a rotation or the Ukrainians have sent more reinforcements, but that's where it has been for almost a week now. The next slide is the fighting around west of Marinka. Now, in the slide, just notice that in the most northern part, where the little squiggly yellow, pumpkin orange yellow line out is, that is the town of Krasnogorovka. Now, the yellow line represents territory that the Ukrainians have recaptured from the Russians. But, and we'll get to this town, but this is just outside of Donetsk, just like Pervomaisky is very close to Donetsk. You could consider it like a village the way Bogdanivka, Chasiv Yar, Ivanivske, these are Solidar, these are all like, honestly, they're like little villages, 6, 7, 10 kilometers away from the city, and suburbs, if you will, right? So you can see in this fighting, the Russians are closing in on the town of Gergiorivka, and of course, last week they captured Pobieda, and this week they've managed to extend their control, just as they've extended their control on the outskirts of Gergiorivka. So they're little by little, the Russians are pushing out from the east. You can see there's not that many fortifications. The Ukrainians do have them, but there is not really that many. And resupplying this area will depend a lot on what kind of caches the Ukrainians have stored in these areas, because the next towns over, could be quite a distance, and they would be open to attack from the air, be it a Lancet, one of the smaller drones, or one of the Russian jet fighters. Next slide, again, we see a close-up of the northern part of this front line around southern Donetsk, and that's, as I mentioned earlier, Krasnogorovka. So you can see Krasnogorovka has good defenses facing eastward, and only a few facing the south. The Russians, through a lot of toil, have managed to get a foothold in this area. The fighting's very hard here. From what I've seen from the Ukrainian sources, they're confident about this area, that they can still hold it. They're not so confident about Novomihailovka. Um, Give me a second and let me see if I can find anything from Novomihailovka. Now, just to refresh everybody, Novomihailovka is, I found it, is another town very close to Donetsk. It's south of Donetsk, but it's in this relative area. And you can see the gains that the Russians have made there. Since our last show and since our show from 2 weeks ago, is what I would say. This is a town that the Ukrainians are afraid of losing. And one of the reasons is because of the capture of Pobieda by the Russians, which is to the north of it. Now, there is fighting going on in the northern part along the let's say the border between Lugansk and Kharkov, in the area of Terne, which is not far. This is the next slide. I've just sent it to you. An area where the Russians and the Ukrainians have lots more fortifications that you can see. The Russians have been very hard fighting here, no surprise. Some armored assault attacks by the Russians. Even with losses, they've been able to capture this forest line, and you can tell that they want to go right to the river's edge here. And this will make it for the Ukrainians very difficult, but it would also give the Russians the opportunity to tack into the forest area from the south, which is a big ordeal because this forest area is very large. And even though the Russians have captured and built many new fortifications there, it has not been easy for them to go any further. And I suppose the other bit of fighting that's happening is in a direction south of Terne, which we were just discussing now. And that's in Belogorovka. Again, you will see the forest, the big forest. The Russians have made some small gains around here. This is one of the areas that the Russians have not been able to move past since the beginning of the war. The Russians captured Belgorod. It went back and forth between the Ukrainians, but for most of 2023, it was in Ukrainian hands. And I would say that's about it for the frontline news. And then I suppose we can get into just some of the attacks, because there have been a lot of attacks that have been happening before and after the raids by the Freedom Legion of Russia and the RDK and all this nonsense. So there was another attack on another hotel in Kharkov, another concentration of Ukrainians. It's believed that the Kraken unit was attacked. It got confirmed this week that one of the Kraken leaders was killed. So, but the attacks in the rear by the Russians have been going on for quite some time, and every once in a while it pays off with these concentrations. There was another one that happened either today or yesterday in the Sumy region. Ukrainians are moving people out of the Sumy area. 22 villages have been evacuated. This is directly across the Russian oblast of Kursk, right? So that could be a reason for it, that the Ukrainians are predicting possibly another attack there. Some of the headlines have been, about from the New York Times, dig, dig, dig. So you can tell that the Western press is trying to get the attention of the Ukrainian elites, besides their own readers in the States, that what Ukraine should do now is dig in. Some jets have been shot down by the Russians. Now, there was a report of a MiG-29 that was shot down by the Ukrainians themselves, and it was the death of a Major Andrei Tachkenko. Um, but then I saw reports saying that he was actually shot down by a Russian Su-35 in Pokrovsk in the Donbass area. Pokrovsk is a hub in the Western Donetsk Republic, or the western part of the Donetsk Oblast now, right? Um, and of course, the Ukrainians have taken on this tradition of burning pianos when one of their fighters pilots dies. It's I didn't know that was a tradition that they had adopted. I heard about it, Mark Felton channel and all that kind of stuff. Um, and then there was um, a younger man. I don't know if it's like a younger photo. I swear it's the same guy, but I can't be sure. That was shot down here. Again, I can't confirm whether he's the same guy or not, or whether it was shot down by Ukrainians or an Su-35. Most say Su-35. Now, the other thing that happened is the Russians attacked um, an area in the Kherson region, uh, right around Nikolaev, just north of it, in sorry, south of it, in Ochakov. So there was two boats that were no one boat that was docked there, and as it turns out, the Russians sent I think a Lancet, um, and the boat was sunk later. It was disclosed that some Ukrainians were on the ship that died. Some commanders, I'm not familiar with them. Yes, it has been reported that Admiral. Yes. So remember, we were talking about uh, the ship Kotov, a missile ship by the Russians, of the Russians that was destroyed by the Ukrainians. So the guy who took over, it has been reported that Admiral Nikolai Yevmenov, commander in chief of the Russian Navy, has resigned, and Admiral Alexander Moiseev has replaced him. So this guy like literally lasted 2 weeks because that's been the second replacement. So this is an ongoing problem that the Russians have had um, in this area, right?
Well, there's just been a
Uh,
lot of interesting developments in the Black Sea since the
mhm,
start of this war, and even actually going back before the start of Russian proper intervention, ignoring the ongoing war in the Donbass from 2014 onward. Do you remember the crisis over the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait back in, I think it was late 2018? And
hmm,
there were the tensions there with the Ukrainians blocking in the Russian ships. So there was that, and what I do think is happening right now, and as far as I know, shipping out of the Black Sea has not been that impeded, all things considered. And I know that Turkey has maintained a very neutral stance in this war, and the Bosphorus has stayed open because of that. But getting into the actual war itself, it's been a concerted effort since the opening months of the war, where particularly the British are helping the Ukrainian Navy coordinate attacks against Russian vessels to varying degrees of success. They have had their strikes. Of course, there was
mhm.
the Moskva that everyone likes to bring up, and even just in the past few weeks, there have been some attacks on naval assets. They hit the naval headquarters in Crimea, which of course nobody of any top brass was there. Nobody or nothing of significance, militarily speaking,
Yeah.
was there, and they just hit what was more or less an empty building at that point. Of course, the Black Sea Fleet commanders are not meeting on the front lines of this war. It's of course not. But it does lend credence to the theory. I don't think it's really that much of a theory with how much Western politicians have outright come and said it. Now we'll see if this actually comes to fruition. That, of course, the war in Ukraine was to soften up the Russian forces before a larger conflict. And they've been saying this openly for years. The Ukrainians are doing all the dying for us. But once again, it has been understood, I would say since at least 2014, for people who've been really paying attention to this, that the Ukrainians were simply going to be the battering ram in event of a greater conflict. Now, the issue with that is it has only emboldened the Russian defense industry. They're more competent than what they were before. This hasn't been the competency crisis in Russia that they had hoped for. But that's not going to let them stop. That's not going to stop them from harassing the Russian fleet in the Black Sea because, as I'm sure anyone who knows the basic history of the area, while the Russians have had a competitive navy throughout its history, and it goes up and down. Among the naval powers, they've never really stood out. Like I said, and you can point to naval successes in a number of different wars they fought in, but in terms of you think the premier navies of the world, the Russians once again don't stand out. Impressive sub fleet under the Soviet Union. You have to give them that much. So there is that, and that just goes down to a difference of doctrine, strategy, etc. But you do have to wonder, and what I think is starting to happen now, because we're seeing these attacks ramp up again with various anti-ship missiles and drones against Russian fleet positions in the Black Sea, is that they're really trying to target the soft spot of the Russian military, which
Yes.
is the Navy.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that the Ukrainians have been going after this week, of course, is the A-50, the analog to the American AWACS planes. And there was an attack that was reported on March the 10th. This is in the Taganrog area. Taganrog is a town on the Azov Sea, and it's in the eastern extremity of that sea, which is a very small sea, by the way, and it's just part of the Black Sea altogether. It's about, I think, 20 kilometers, maybe 30 kilometers from the border with like former Ukraine and Donetsk. So there was damage that was reported to the building. There's three areas. One of the Ukrainian UAVs hit very close to one of the AWACS planes. Let me see. No, it was not an AWACS. The AWACS plane that was there was one of two planes. The other planes, I'm just looking at the photos, the satellite photos at the moment. So they were moved from this area. It could mean that they're getting better intelligence. Like one of the strikes, the reason some of the strikes, and I'll get to them, that the Russians have been successful with their Iskander missiles lately on Ukrainian concentrations of manpower is because they have the Iskander missiles now have more jamming antennae fastened to them. Instead of 4, there are now 8. There was one Iskander that landed that didn't detonate, and the Ukrainians now have figured out why this is the case. So yeah, the Ukrainians are definitely hunting for the A500 because they're very important for Russia's let's say aerial success at the moment, because it's definitely true that the Russians now dominate the airspace over Ukraine. Oh, I wouldn't say the way the Americans did in Iraq, but more than at any point in this war.
I Very crude comparison, but I would say comparable to American air superiority in Vietnam, where they
Hmm.
still did face resistance. They still did lose aircraft, and the Vietnamese, insofar as they actually did engage the North, did have an air force and they did have anti-aircraft. But when it came down to a competition, if America was willing to eat the losses, they would be able to establish complete air superiority. Same case with the Russians, but once again, are you willing to pay that price for what is realistically good enough?
Hmm. 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 Yeah, I won't get into it, but there was an interesting article that Tim Pool posted from a Telegram channel called Aluminum about the JDAMs and how the JDAM system. I'll just read maybe the first 3, 4 paragraphs. issue with JDAMs is that same issue that Russia had with the UMPK until recently. Long-range SAMs are still very effective against the carriers. However, Russia was able to circumvent that with strikes against numerous radars and launchers, which were vulnerable due to a few factors. One, limited range of even long-range models. Inefficient PESA radars prone to leakage and ARM vulnerability. Lack of SHORAD protection. I have no idea what any of this means. I hope the audience does. Russian air defenses will be far harder to crack because in their IAD's architecture, Russia has baked in a far greater 240 to 400 kilometer standoff and widespread AESA ECM resistant fire control. Also, Russia has an air force with a larger number of standoff LRAAM, which could easily down aircraft reaching JDAM range. So again, what it seems to be saying is they can detect radars before the radars can detect them. And I distinctly remember in 2022 that this was a problem that the Russians had. So there's all kinds of innovation that still keeps like in all wars keeps going on. And then there's an interesting part about key point to remember: stealth coatings are only capable of reducing the range of effective radar detection, not making them invisible. With current technology, a stealth fighter will reduce effective detection range by 65 to 70%. So an active radar seeker effective to around 30 kilometers against an F-16 will still work from 10 kilometers away against, say, an F-35. Then there's the fact that the Russian radars of modernized Nebo family can have such range to detect and track objects in L-band from 1,800 kilometers away. These will be reduced to 600 kilometers against stealth fighters. Anyways, this might, well, I guess we'll get into Macron, but the Russians also had a very successful, this week, very successful attacks on mercenaries in Ukraine. Now, in the last few weeks, I've seen Canadian, American, Georgian mercs that have been killed, that have reported to have been killed. British fighter, when Liz Truss was Prime Minister, Harry Craig has committed suicide. But there was as I said, there was an attack in the Kharkov direction again. But if we go back a few months, there was an attack where a major hotel in Kharkov was attacked, and it was like a fancy hotel. This wasn't like one of these 2-3 story like brick buildings. This, lots of glass, more modern looking. And as it turns out, that was filled with a lot of French mercenaries. And according to Macron's statements this week, the Russians had accused them of sending mercs. They denied it, and a tipping point arose because during that Kharkov attack, ambulances went to gather the wounded from the Kharkov, and the Russians attacked again. So that could also be a reason why Macron is furious with the Russians and why he's made those statements. But I personally think this, even for a guy like Macron, there are other reasons. But it's just when we talk about Macron, maybe keep that in mind. Now, to get to Odessa, so Odessa on March the 11th, there was a major attack there, and again, it was let's say a concentration of Ukrainian military. The Ukrainians posted the photos. Vitaly Malutin, Mykola Tyagi, Alexander Konovalyenko, Ivan Glushko, and Oleg Bieletsky. So all these guys were eliminated that day. in Odessa on the 11th, and there are also reports that the Russians did the same thing that they did in Kharkov, which angered the French. And that is when they went to retrieve them, then the Russians did a second attack. Now, recall also that the Ukrainians did the same thing when they attacked centers in Donetsk city or the suburbs, and they killed an entire crew of medical personnel and ambulance drivers. I mentioned that in one of the February episodes. So it could be, like for like, if you will. Um, let's see. I'm trying to. So those are, those are the. Now there have been also a lot of attacks on Russian oil refineries. There was one on the 11th on Orlo, and I'm going to send you a picture of. These are very common now that what the Ukrainians are managing to do. They just so this is from the 12th of March to the 16th of March. You can see 5 different attacks. The one that happened today was in Sizran, and you can see that they're very much deep into Russian territory. Of course, um, some of them. There's the Oral at the picture on the bottom left, but that gives you an idea of the kind of cooperation that exists between NATO and Ukraine, because when the Ukrainians like hit one of these targets, or they go after an A-50 that's resting at an airfield, or they sink a Russian ship, like all of that is done with the help of the British and the Americans, right? And um, I can't remember who, but one of the British military brass mentioned that there was that they helped them destroy the Kotov and the landing ship before it. Interestingly, Schnaps, whatever his name is, the new defense minister for the UK, he was on a plane in Poland, and apparently the Russians jammed his plane. It was an interesting article about that. So let me go on and see if there's anything more. I guess the other thing we can begin talking about. Um, I'm just looking at the names. Yeah, mm, uh, March 6th there was another attack on Odessa. Okay, yes, these are different names: Vladimir Butov, Vyacheslav Viselyev, Stanislav Khoklov. Um, So this has been going on for quite a while, these attacks in Odessa. And I think this attack that happened for these 6 servicemen that were killed of the Ukrainians, that is when Mitsotakis was visiting Zelensky in Odessa. So it could be just, the Russians are focusing on Odessa and trying to intimidate them, but at the same time, they're not afraid to attack that city even when a NATO aligned country leader happens to be there, even though they're not going to go for him. They're not going to kill Zelensky. Oh yeah, and there was also a Canadian that was killed, originally from Campbellton, New Brunswick, 49-year-old with the Norman Brigade. So I guess did you want to talk about the incursions of the Freedom Legion of Russia and
Oh,
all
of
that?
course, of course. But I did want to touch first on the Ukrainian taps deeper into Russia.
Mm.
Of course, they are coordinated by NATO. This is no secret to anyone who's been paying attention to this war, and anyone who is even the slightest bit honest will admit that. And I do have to wonder if, going forward, the strategy here is to, because they understand at this point, the Pentagon, the State Department, the American Empire in general, just for the sake of simplicity, and their proxies, understand that Ukraine cannot win this war. It, barring
Hmm.
an outright NATO intervention, Ukraine cannot win this war. And I'm even on the fence about whether they want a NATO intervention or not, because I see signs pointing in both directions. I don't want to get too conspiratorial, but I do think with some of the statements we see coming out of Europe right now, there may be some A/B testing going on, really feeling out how the general population feels towards Russia at this time, how dedicated they are to this war effort. Because you went back to October, back when Israel and Hamas first began their most recent war. Enthusiasm and interest in Ukraine was completely diminished. And it stayed that way until about the end of the year of 2023. But it does seem, as we got into the new year, as we got into later January, especially into February, interest in Ukraine was suddenly revived.
Hmm.
And what I do think is a possibility, I don't want to say anything for certain with this because there's so much speculation that can be had, is that these attacks deeper into Russia aren't necessarily for any sabotage purpose. Sure, that is an added benefit, but I do think they want to provoke a larger response from the Russians that will make them look more brutal, that will make them look like the merciless army they've been trying to portray them as for 2 years, in order to justify increased aid and support to Ukraine, if not outright intervention by one or more Western powers or their proxies. I know I really harped on Poland gets involved in the war. I still think that is a distinct possibility, even though with Tuscan power, that is a very strange case, and with Ukrainian Polish relations, they're very strained despite the fact that Poland still is one of the largest supporters of Ukraine in the world at this point. And the Europeans are exacerbated, but this war, they've staked everything on it. If not the people, then their leadership, who are closely aligned with Washington. They're all Atlanticists. Even Le Pen came out this week and started harping on the Ukraine issue and more or less saying that it was an unjustified invasion, blah, blah, blah. NATO. Once again, going against what she had said for years. That's how all encompassing this conflict has become. So far, I think the only quote unquote populist movement that has resisted the Ukraine rhetoric that actually is of any significance at this point is the AFD in Germany. And look what the German state is doing them right now. Complete and total persecution, trying to shut down the party in its entirety. So that shows you the state of European politics right now. But getting back to the question of Russia escalation, I'll bring up that map again just so everyone can get an idea of what we're talking about. At this point, it is two pronged. Of course, these are going to heat up for the election, try to create instability in Russia, maybe raise a few question marks about Putin's ability to defend the Russian nation. Why is this inadequate? Playing on the strings of people who, once again, support the war, support the current government, but they want to cast that doubt. Okay, if this is happening, if Ukraine is over there and we're the larger, stronger country, why are they still able to make these incursions? Sure, they know it's the West, but it might lead to some doubts. Now, I think it'll ultimately have the opposite effect of they're going to keep escalating this war, so it's time to rally behind the flag and support the current regime, and that love him or hate him, Putin's the guy in charge now, and he's the only realistic chance we have of winning this war. That's what I think the outcome is probably going to be. I'm going to be curious about the election margins, as I'd mentioned before, to see once again who the number two candidate is and what margins that Putin officially wins by. And of course, you can speculate all you want about election. I mean, but we all know that even in a fair election, he would win handily. Just it, like I said,
Hmm. Hmm.
it's just the nature of Russia, just the nature of how their political and culture, their politics and culture mesh with that. But like I said, I'll return to that later. But at this point, looking at the strikes beyond the trying to raise questions of legitimacy among the Russian populace, I do have to wonder with the frequency, especially with the attacks on the Black Sea Fleet. As I said before, the Russian Navy, probably the weakest link in the Russian military, if they're trying to provoke a let's just say, less rational response from Russia and trying to instill a little bit of panic maybe in the high command to make them make a stupid decision. Because that's the only thing that I can really come to that makes
Hmm.
sense.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the other is this, right? If you were a Cold War warrior, right, your main task, for those 70 some odd years, well, not quite 70, but like, let's say 45, 50 years, right?
Yeah, the people have been in
And,
there
and
since the 70s and 80s.
right, and well into the 90s, right? The idea was the Soviet Union fell apart because its envy for the West was just insatiable, and eventually, whatever it was that held that was the social glue for this, um, I don't know, empire or
Regime.
union, right, fell apart. It just could not be believed in anymore. And I think they're aiming for the same thing, right? Like it's a kind of terror this time instead of envy, because the Russians don't necessarily envy the Europeans. Um, and so now it has to be terror, right? The terror can stop if you get rid of Putin and you get out of Ukraine. So that's the premise now, I think.
I I completely concur with that. I think that is probably the other reasonable explanation for that because as you had said, of course, it was the cultural power in the 1980s. It was the lack of direction or civilizational narrative on the part of the Soviet Union moving into the 70s and 80s, and of course, with its collapse in the early 90s. But at this point, you're right. It's, oh, look, Russia can be part of the West now, what they wanted to do 20 years ago. If they concede to all our demands, if they
Yeah.
decolonize, of course, we're going to decolonize Russia, as they love to really harp on about that. And that is really what
Hmm.
what the West's conditions are for any sort of peace negotiation. Not only a complete surrendering in Ukraine, but a complete surrendering of national interests in order to
Yeah.
even begin negotiations, which shows that they're fundamentally unserious party about this.
Yeah.
And of course, you had that joint statement by, I believe it was Poland. Uh, Once again, I'm joined by another co-host here, by France, Germany, the UK, and Poland, I believe. Of course, the regular coalition that you would expect for NATO, saying that we are committed to Ukraine's victory is
Hmm.
something along those lines to what they had said. And I do believe that. I don't think that the Western elite is going to budge on Ukraine anytime soon. I think it's more. I know it's cliche to say. It's been used a million times as a phrase, but I do think they are dedicated to fighting to the last Ukrainian. I saw that there was a
Hmm.
take from, what was that guy's name? The Lutwak guy who's been giving, of course, all the regular pro-Ukrainian shit. Edward Lutwak made a tweet, I believe yesterday it was, yesterday or today. It doesn't. Um, Point being, it was recently, complaining
Hmm.
about the conscription age of Ukrainian men being 27 is when they're starting to conscript them because they don't want to tap into the younger population pool yet
Yeah.
for obvious demographic reasons. However, those men are barred from leaving the country, but they are not subjected to service yet. And he's saying that they need to open up the recruitment pools for men from 18 to 26, which is the traditional conscription age. If you look at the American military, at most Western militaries, that is the pool of the population they would draw upon if put in that situation. But he gave some figures about, oh, this would open up this and the population demographics, blah, blah, blah. I will once again return to a graph I saw. I need to bring this up. So let me get this here. Just about the status of Ukrainian military aged men. And this is the tweet right here from the account from Kherson. And this is Ukrainska Pravda numbers. and it's a translation of this graph right here. But as you can see, the majority of military, okay, not majority, excuse me, the plurality of military aged men in Ukraine live in Russian controlled territory, for starters. And then you go on, I've gone over this graph before, but that still leaves 950,000 eligible for future conscription waves, which the conscription waves have dropped off because of how hard it has been to enforce. So, this has been a problem plaguing Ukraine for a number of months now, and if not since the beginning of the war, if you really want to push back. I would say since the summer counteroffensive of 2022, ever since that fizzled out, and of course they had some further successes with the Russians pulling back from parts of Kherson, etc. But once that wave of Ukrainian success ended, they have been faced with the perpetual problem of manpower shortage, equipment shortage, and it's just been a game of grinding. Because early on in the war, you had the Russians go in, and after the negotiations fell through, they decided they were going to dig in and fight this war of attrition, which it still seems to be the direction that they're going right now. But the Ukrainians had more manpower, they had more resources, they were able to conduct offensive because at that point the Russians were simply not in a position to ground down the Ukrainian resource. But we're getting to the point, at least in my opinion. Now, who knows? Maybe another major Western aid package will come in, or maybe the Ukrainians have some wild trick up their sleeve. But I think we're starting to see the, for lack of a better word, attrition strategy start to pay off for the Russians, where the Ukrainians
Mhm.
are slowly grounding themselves down. And it really leaves, if you want to continue this war, you have two options, and that is either through multiple waves call up those 950,000 men, find other workarounds to expand that pool, maybe drop the age, as that idiot Lookwalk was saying, or you can take a series of escalatory actions that are not even endorsed by the Pentagon, mind you. Even the U.S. is a little skittish about this. They get cold feet about this. Take a series of escalatory actions that make it the rest of the world's problem. And I do think that the Ukrainians have went for option B, because I think option A at this point would be certainly in the end of Zelensky's career, if not the end of Zelensky altogether.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But going on to what you had brought up before, because I do think this is part of it, the attacks into Belgorod yet again. Now,
Yeah.
I believe this is, in terms of this war, the third time Belgorod has been hit by this, because I know there was the incursion into Bryansk a few months ago. Then there was the missile strike on Belgorod. And now you have the incursion into Belgorod again, even though I do think there was
Well,
an...
last year they did an incursion.
Yeah.
Remember the Financial Times,
Yes, that was the one, and that's because the
or business something. I think it was the Financial Times though that did a story on it. Remember, literally the day they went in, they had a story. Just like 6 hours later, they had a story. So it was all lined up, right? This was all well coordinated, well in advance. You're supposed to believe like some of these groups of anti-Kremlin Russian nationalists. They have a few hundred members. Yet they also have like MRAPs, Bradleys, MBPs. Like they have all this hardware, including howitzers and I don't know, and tanks, of course. But they're not filled with Ukrainians. Of course, they're filled with Ukrainians. The majority of those guys dying, and I'll show you some of the horrific photos. They're Ukrainians, like except for like the leader. Uh, and that leader is that guy who left Russia because his mother was Jewish, and she had like uh, Germany had a program for both like Volga Germans who were not Jewish, but also people of Jewish descent in Russia. They could move to Germany. So, and he's the one who created the RDK. This like ultra nationalist Russian Nazi who's who's half Jewish.
These are the nationalists that Putin persecutes, by the way, whenever anyone brings that up.
Yeah, yeah.
And look, I will say with full disclosure, I've talked to plenty of Russians who have their issues with Putin. Now they aren't frothing at the mouth about it, but if that he's not their first choice, but they'll take him from just the general consensus of a lot of people I've spoken to. Now, of course, I'm
Hmm.
going to have a little bit of selection bias here, but once again, when you hear the point about these so-called nationalists that Putin is persecuting, these are the people who he went after, the people who go abroad to Germany, who are of Jewish ancestry, because of course we are wonderful, great National Socialists. We're the spitting image of the German excellence, of course. And in order to show how nationalistic we are, we're going to launch indiscriminate attacks against our co-ethnics. That is what is come down to. And I I'm not even Russian, and
Yeah, yeah,
I have
yeah.
a certain
Well, in
level of
Ukraine, they
contempt for
arrested
these
three
people.
RDK
But
members.
oh, go on. I actually didn't hear about that part.
Yeah, so the one of the guys, when he was being interrogated, admitted that for Mariupol, they wanted to poison the water there. Like, so according to the testimonies of the detainees, they planned not only UAV attacks in Russia, but also poisoning with chemical substances, humanitarian aid for Mariupol citizens, and supplies that were to reach the Russian. And they have a big beef because I don't know if the audience knows who Española Battalion is. It's a Russian ultra extreme right wing battalion. And one of their leaders was recently killed, either this week or the week before. But it's interesting that these RDK members living in St. Petersburg were caught. These guys weren't on the ground, as far as I understand from this article. So yeah, they are the definition of useful idiots, and these attacks into the Belgorod and the Kursk region. Now, there's really only been one incursion in the Kursk region. The other three attacks are all in the Belgorod region. That's where they've gone. And of course, by now everybody has heard the ridiculous stories about how they literally went to this one village, pretending it was a village on the Russian side.
With
But it,
signs in Ukrainian as they were marching
Yeah,
in.
that's another one with the BTRs. Yes, yes, but this this one was like literally a village, not like a town with like 4 or 5 story buildings. The one with the blue and like decorative paint job. People debunked that right away. Of course, it went really big on Twitter. Naturally, we're winning, and so now, of course, there have been civilian deaths in Belgorod. A voting station was bombed. A driver of a car was killed when one of the MLRS rockets hit the car. Um, it's a Czech version of their, I believe, the Russian or Ukrainian Urgan rocket launchers, the Vampire, and that was destroyed. But they have plenty of them. We don't even know if that was the one that did it. So definitely, like a number of people have been killed. Of course, the Ukrainians relish that, like the Russians have to bomb their own towns to do it. However, on the first day of these attacks, right, and they began really March 14th, not 15th. The start of the voting process in Russia began on the 15th, yesterday. But I'll send you like, I mean, this is just a still. An area that had like a concentration of Ukrainians that had gone over to fight. Now, a lot of them, honestly, they died before ever crossing the border, and then they died afterwards. And today, more attacks on Belgorod, the city. They had footage that was so absolutely fake of the people of Belgorod are running away, and they made all kinds of announcements. Listen to your ancestors within you. They want you to overthrow this tyrant. By the way, Belgorod is actually Ukrainian.
Belgorod is Ukrainian, which is why we're going to once again launch
Yeah,
indiscriminate attacks against our own co-ethnics, siding with the group that claims to be liberating Russia,
yeah,
with Belgorod as a Russian town. And of
yeah.
course,
These, these
none of it makes sense.
yeah,
It's
these
all.
these nationalists really want Russia to be a lot smaller. Isn't that interesting?
Is this the acceleration I've been hearing about?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Dennis Nikitin is the guy that the half Jewish uh I don't know, what is he, president or commander of the RDK. He's not going to
So you're
go and
telling
fight.
me he's the evil version of Zhirinovsky?
Yeah.
That's what I'm gathering from all of this.
Yeah, it's honestly so ridiculous. Yeah.
But I expect these attacks into border towns to continue to ramp up, especially as the Russians complete the election cycle. As the election cycle is finished, that's going to continue into that. And of course, as the U.S. election cycle picks up, unless the Russians have secured a resounding victory at this point, which I don't think is in the cards, I do think that we will see a significant amount of Russian progress this year, but I'm not going to make any strong predictions right now in so far as what exactly that will be. But I do think it's going to be a good year for Russia. I just need to see how the front develops before I say this, and this. But I do expect if this conflict is still in force by the time of the U.S. election, by the time of September, October, when the election really picks up, especially if Trump does maintain his rhetoric about not funding Ukraine, which he has stuck to mostly. There's been some waffling. We'll get into a little bit of that later. They're going to ramp up these attacks. They're going to make the Russian populace bear the brunt of really this election cycle in the United States on top of their own election cycle. They're going to push as far as they can because although it probably wouldn't happen, just the mere possibility of Ukraine having funding cut is going to drive them to do more and more drastic things.
Mm.
And I do think that for that reason, we're going to see, especially with someone like Sirski in command. Now, who knows how long he'll last? I honestly couldn't tell you. But especially with someone like Sirski and, of course, Zelensky, I can see a lot of irrational moves coming out of Ukraine, a lot of costly offensives, a lot of just really stupid, counterintuitive actions when it comes to defending what is left of Ukraine in order to secure the funding of their Western sponsors. Because once again, it's a cycle. We've gone over this before. We're certainly not the only ones. The Ukrainian leadership will have their men march into the slaughter for some headline. And then the Western press will take that, show it to the people, which thereby justifies more funding going to Ukraine because they can convince a significant minority of people that this is necessary. Then you can write off the apathetic who really don't care one way or another, while the people who oppose it are left in a certain minority. And of course, funding to Ukraine continues because of that. And even with the conflict in Israel, this still continues. I will get into Chuck Schumer's comments about Netanyahu and just the situation in the Middle East in general because you can tell out of the conflicts that they're trying to put a lid on, it's Israel right now. Ukraine has returned to the forefront, and believe it or not, Israel has been snubbed, but we'll get to that at a later point. And what I what I do have to wonder is what is the resilience of the Ukrainian nation to this very performative leadership? How much will they tolerate? Because Zelensky is already waning in popularity. There are already a significant groups of influential people who do not like him and would like to see him replaced. Now, he's canceled the election. He was supposed to be up for re-election around the same time as Putin. That's gone out the window. And there's no there's no major figure ever since Zaluzhny was sent to London that can really stand to oppose him.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder what Ukrainian state infrastructure looks like and how much longer this will be able to continue. And of course, U.S. and Western funding is vital for that. They are the ones paying the salaries and the pensions of these Ukrainians right now. And is it the population of Ukraine, especially if they do expand conscription, which once they don't want to touch the conscription issue. Sure, they'll throw people in vans, they'll get who they can here and there, but in terms of the mass mobilization waves that we've seen the past 10, I would be hard pressed to believe that there's going to be another one because of how unpopular it has gotten, and that the Ukrainian state has spent almost every bit of legitimacy it has had on this war effort to to completely no avail. In fact, they have lost more than they would have had they accepted the peace terms from April 2022. And it really creates a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for the Ukrainian leadership, because if they were to rump the white flag tomorrow and enter into negotiations, they would get a less favorable deal than what they got in April 2022 at the cost of more men, at the cost of mass immigration, at the cost of their economy, and really everything that makes a nation a nation. So the only option that they have to maintain legitimacy is no better, where they have to continue this war indefinitely until they either win or are wiped out. That's really the mentality of the Ukrainian leadership, because there is no favorable peace terms, especially after the goodwill that they burnt with the Russian negotiators. And that's simply not coming back. Even the most conciliatory Russian leader in uh, centuries, possibly, maybe not centuries, but in decades, certainly, it has been convinced that there's no negotiations we have this war, that the goals of the special military operation must be complete, in his words. Now, what those are, of course, I mean, there's the general things, but insofar as Russia's endgame in Ukraine, of course, we don't know, which, I mean, that's probably on purpose, because they don't want to do what the Ukrainians do and just blurt out all their plans because they have some sponsor to impress. And at this point, once again, the Ukrainians have the Ukrainian leadership in particular has put itself in a position where they can't negotiate, but they can't win. And so, what does that mean? Annihilation, barring NATO getting involved. In which case, that is going to be, and I say this without exaggeration, an apocalyptic scenario if I would say one or more NATO countries get involved. Now, sure, you might be able to tolerate, say, Poland, Romania, etc., getting involved. That would just be an escalation of an already unfavorable scenario. But if that metastasizes, which I do think if we see the first waves going in, it most likely will, we're talking something that we have not seen since the end of the Second World War, and I don't even want to imagine what that outcome would be.
Yeah, I mean there is a desperation that is setting in. Um, I don't think the Americans themselves are planning to go into Ukraine unless Europeans go in first.
Oh no, that is the order of how Ukraine will work. That the Ukrainians have to wear it down, then the rest of the Europeans, then the Anglos, then the Americans. That's how, if we're going to see NATO intervention, it will most likely be in that order.
Yeah. So um, yeah, I mean I just want to, because I saw this on Twitter. I hate to return to Odessa yet again,
No, go
but
ahead.
um, so Ukrainian telegrams are talking about this. It seems like since the last show, there have been a lot of attacks um, going on in Odessa, and I saw a guy on Twitter, Nate Mook. I'm in shock. Two friends were murdered by the Russians in Odessa this morning. They went to help after the first missile attack. This is what I was talking about, and the second missile hit. This is my brother Sergey. I mean, I don't think he means that's his literal brother. So Ukrainian telegram channels write that during the Iskander M missile attack on Odessa, the following people were killed: commander of Tsunami Battalion, Alexander Gostchev, deputy head of the main directorate of the National Police in Odessa region, who received an award from Zelensky in the fall of 2022. Sergei Tetutkin, former deputy head of Odessa, mobilized in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine in November 23, and Dmitry Abramenko, another deputy of the main directorate of the National Police in Odessa. That's who he's talking about. So very devastating. The Russians are really focusing on taking out anybody that's planning anything in Odessa. Some of it might be retaliatory because honestly, those strikes in Belgorod have been pretty intense since late December of last year till now. I saw a video where cars get flipped in the street because of an attack in the center of Belgorod. So it's not like, it's not a joking matter. They're not going to take the city. Obviously, these guys can't even they haven't even captured a village over the border, but that doesn't mean that they're not inflicting damage. They are. But there is one theory that I saw pop up, and even the guys in the Duran talked about it, but that's not the first place I heard about it. And that is, the Russians apparently have a nuclear weapons silo system not far from Belgorod. And it would make sense why there are so many Russian troops in this region. Apart from waiting for 11 months for the RDK and company to make another incursion into the Belgorod Oblast, it would make sense that even before the SMO, one of the reasons why they might have either faked like they're protecting this, but honestly, the Russians have had 100,000 troops in this area since the beginning of the SMO. Remember when they were losing regions in Kharkov and everybody's going, what are they doing? Why don't they send them? So there's this theory that, these latest incursions by the RDK and the Free Legion of Russia and the Ukrainians who filled their ranks, they sent about 2,500 to 3,000 troops. 40 tanks, close to 40 tanks, 32 armored personnel carriers. People have argued that they should have had twice the number of armored personnel carriers, but you have to ask yourself, after about, do they have that many that they can spare for this job? I don't know what to think of it. I imagine that this facility, it might be close to Belgorod, but I just can't imagine that that's enough forces for the Ukrainians. Maybe they thought they could have like a breakthrough, but honestly, I just think it's like it's a way to divert attention away from the front lines in the war in Ukraine. And there was a rotation. A lot of the former Wagner guys were rotated out to replace the conscript guys. These are young guys. The guys that are guarding this border, they're not like, I mean, some of the ones that took were Spetsnaz, some of them were special forces. Some of the Ukrainians that went over the border, they were also special forces. But the vast majority of the Russian side, they're not special forces. And basically what they did is they evacuated out of these villages, and then the Russians just went on them whole hog. And like I say, there are lots of videos where you can see dozens of these guys are dead. So, but with that out of the way, yeah, strategy. I suppose Macron is he's become kind of the touchstone for what is a strategy of the war going forward in Ukraine, right? Every time somebody says, "Oh, he's backed off," on his statements. I don't think so. I don't think he's backing off. At first, remember, everybody rebuked him. And now you have, the Baltic countries. Of course, the Baltic countries understand that they have only some hundreds of men or a few thousands of men to contribute. They fully understand that they won't and can't do most of the fighting. That means the bigger nations will have to participate. So it's easy for them to get rowdy, right? But Poland has also voiced support for Macron. And that's a considerably sized army. I would hazard to say that it's probably a bigger army than what the Germans have. Now on mainland Europe, there's no question that the French have the biggest army.
Oh, absolutely. It goes back to what I've said before in terms of actual war-ready militaries in NATO. You
Yeah,
have the U.S., you have France, you have Poland and Turkey, and
right.
at least for the
Now they have
context
about two
of
hundred
what we're talking
thousand.
about. But go on.
Yeah, the French have about 200,000. And last week I made a mistake saying um, what I meant to say that about half of them, or a little under half, would be required. What is what the Ukrainians had invested in that whole Avdiivka Donetsk front. And that it doesn't include just Avdiivka or the villages around it, like Orlovka, but other places like Pervomayske, for instance, is one of them. Novomihailovka. So that front has like close to 100,000 men, right? These villages and small towns right next to Donetsk city. Um, Krasnogorovka is another example. So um, that in and of itself is not enough, right? So the Poles have to enter the war. You see crazy articles in Politico, for instance, saying that Baerbock is trying to convince Scholz to send in the Taurus missiles. Scholz, I think, is afraid to send them in because eventually those Taurus missiles, one of them will not will be intercepted, and I don't know, rightly or wrongly, he is afraid that the technology for the Taurus missile will be discovered, whereas the French don't actually care. Now, to be fair to the Germans, right? Um, to be fair to the Germans, they've given a lot more than per capita than the French have. No, I wouldn't underestimate the French. The French, for instance, since last year, have been giving to the Ukrainians a type of 155 millimeter shell that bursts in the air. This causes what was it in the Napoleonic era? This is like, what did they call it?
The grape shot.
Grape shot, right? So it has that kind of an effect, right? But they sent them over 30 Caesars, right? These are the mechanized artillery pieces that fired the 155 millimeter shells. Um, kind of like the Swedish archer in principle, right? Generally in principle. So, um, and they're sending more supplies, right? Macron has always had he's always wanted this kind of leadership position. Um, remember that in liberal democracies, no president is ever that popular, right? And the media is very important in creating a legacy for them. George Bush Jr. was, popular but not popular. The same thing is true of Biden. Okay. Um, Obama, for different reasons, is also could be put in this camp. But they're leaders, but at the same time, they have a kind of a figurehead quality about them. And let's say, in search of stability, right, within liberal democracies, the rule of law, the voting, right? Everybody presumes that you can vote them out, and you will, if you work hard enough, and that's that. And you'll get a new leader, and everything will be better, or much things will improve at least, right? So I don't think like no Western leader actually cares if the population doesn't like them. right? Because that's kind of the norm now. Nobody likes Trudeau. Like, he's incredibly unpopular. Like Macron, they're both under 30%. It doesn't matter. The same thing is true of Schultz. So, Macron said a lot of interesting things. He said, we don't have any security, and if Russia wins, Europe will have no security. He said that Russia is an existential threat to France, and that France has already suffered. Take a look at our hospitals, and I'm thinking, like, hospitals? Like, is this the bed bug thing? remember last year they were blaming a rash of bed bugs on the Russians? There were cartoons about this. It's just so preposterous, right? Now, he also said that he wouldn't initiate anything. He wouldn't lead anything. Like, France is there to protect Kiev, but at the same time, he says Russia must not win. That the loss in credibility would be too much. It's true; it would be an incredible loss of credibility. But I would say that they've lost already a lot of credibility, and when I say they, I mean America as well. So, unless they have some storage of armaments that they've been reluctant to give to Ukraine for all these months, and you're supposed to believe that Johnson really has all this power, and no whip can drive them to a different position. I don't know. I don't know if they have like what it takes to go in. It would have to escalate really quickly. I don't think Putin wants them to go in. I don't think they really want to go in.
No, and at this point, the status quo benefits Russia,
Yeah,
and the West knows that it can't tolerate that, but they know any solution is going to be a cost that, at least at this point, they're not willing to incur, which
right.
really puts it in a position of who's going to fire the first shot. In the broader sense between the West and Russia, because of course there is, not to downplay the active war in Ukraine, but when it comes to direct confrontation between the West and Russia, it is the ultimate question of who is going to fire the first shot. And I really don't know. I know that Macron, as you said, is really trying to posture himself, trying to place himself in a position of leadership, a position of authority, somebody who can be taken seriously. But his statements are toothless. We're going to stand up for Ukraine, we're going to defend Ukraine, but we're not going to lead any efforts. It's an assumption and abdication of responsibility all in one statement. And it's been blithering incoherence is really the only word I can put to it. But
I would just here's what I agree
go ahead.
with you. I agree with you, but I'm saying, like, if you put it in context, right? A slow change he is setting the possibility of some kind of a coalition of the willing, right? Like 2 weeks ago, a week ago, that didn't exist. That's
Oh, I agree.
right. Like, you can't count him out. I guess it's strategic ambivalence and ambiguity. Sorry, it's strategic ambiguity. That's what he's intentionally doing. The reports that he's moving troops to Romania, I've seen some posts saying that's not true. There isn't any there in Romania. I mean, not more than there is anyways. Yes. So, that interview, he talked pretty tough overall, even though, as you say, it wasn't really coherent. Um, but he did say, I'm trying to find bear with me.
Ladies and
Darn
gentlemen, the
it.
Jupiterian president. My thoughts are too complex for journalists.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, Australia is going to be producing HIMARS missiles. They're opened up a plant there, and Australia is kind of important in the sense that some of the drones that have been used to attack Belgorod and the towns around it, they're using drones made out of paper. So that's interesting. But rather than try to find the exact quote of the kind of things that Macron said, I will point this out because we're talking about strategy. Does the West go in, right? When Macron makes the statement that if Russia threatens to take Kiev or Odessa, they will go in. Okay, but Russia's nowhere near doing that. So it's not something that he has to worry about. Kind of like, we're going to donate tanks. And by the way, we're donating 10-wheeled tanks that have to stop in order to shoot because they don't have a modern firing mechanism, the way a T-80 or even a T-64 or an Abrams or a Challenger have, right? But maybe the other giveaway, and I don't know how long he is for this world, is Klitschko, has the mayor of Kiev. He's really complaining about Zelensky and about democracy is dying in Ukraine. There ought to be elections. Vladimir Klitschko said, if in wartime it is possible to replace Zelensky, the same can be done with Zelensky. And here's what I mean about strategy, right? By the Russians going slow, what they want to do, and I've been saying this on the show for a long time, you've been saying it as well, is that they want to create like a, crock pot sort of boiling situation where eventually it overheats and there are fractures within Ukrainian command. And that becomes so disastrous that it becomes easier for the Russians to roll over. Are they waiting for this? I think time will tell whether Zelensky is able to get rid of Klitschko as well. The fact of the matter is, the Ukrainians are having a very hard time conscripting people. Now they have somewhere between 2.5 to 3 million men that they could conscript. Right. Some of them are going to be very young. Some of them are going to be very old, or maybe a little too old, not very old. But that's what they've got. The men who left for Russia, the men who left for Europe, and the men who left for the new territories that Russia conquered, they're not going to go back. And, these press gangs, this is a video in Lvov region where one guy, he just eventually starts smacking one of these recruiters that wanted to take him away. So yes, I know that they're taking most of the men from central and eastern Ukraine because they don't look at them as proper Ukrainians to begin with, because many of them are Russian speakers. But at the same time, eventually they're going to have to go for more from Galicia. Now, I'm not saying they haven't. They do, and a lot of the crack units, the enforcing units of, let's say, Kraken, Idar, Azov, they're from there. They're there to make sure that the guys who are conscripted from the center and from the east of Ukraine don't mutiny, that they don't abandon their posts, right? They're enforcers. They're there as the active in the part of active defense. They're not there just waiting every day in the trenches. That's for, the unlucky guys. So it's a question of, what are they going to do? Yes, part of it is, winning is the best propaganda you can have. And a lot of the Western propaganda that they've had for 2 years is being debunked. They understand that the stalemate is now tipped in Russia's favor, and that it could just keep continuing to snowball. And it won't be like It'll take Russia 10 years to reach Kiev because every month it will be a weaker Ukraine that they will have to fight. Okay. If they don't get more conscription, if they don't get more arms, it won't be like fighting the Ukraine, like the fighting the Ukraine of 2022 November is not the same as fighting the Ukraine of January 2024.
And then there's always the $1 million question, which I've been bringing up for quite some time. I don't have an answer for it myself, but it's something that everyone who looks at the war needs to consider. At what point does morale completely bottom out in the Ukrainian military? I mean,
Mm, mm.
it hasn't so far, but with, just to cite a recent example in the past month, with what we saw from the loss of Avdiivka and leaving the men to get surrounded without giving their retreat orders, this is how the Ukrainian military is going to conduct its war effort. They're not even going to pull out that vital manpower they keep saying that they have issues with, but let them get surrounded in a completely indefensible position and be taken prisoner.
Yeah,
And frankly, I think at this rate, a lot of them are probably going to be treated better as POWs than in the AFU itself,
yeah,
which is a very sad state of affairs for any war, anything. It should not be that way. But if Zelensky, if Syrskyi, if any of these other clowns are going to continue employing those strategies, they're going to continue conducting the war like this. How much more morale does this Ukrainian military have? They already sacked Zaluzhny because they knew sooner or later he would make a move on power unless he was exiled to somewhere like London, in which case he will sit in the embassy, he will be a good ambassador, and he will be far removed from the internal politics of Ukraine. And how many more potential rivals does Zelensky have? As you were saying, Klitschko, as something is going to happen to him soon. He's either going to be forced to resign, he's going to be
yeah.
eliminated. They're going to do something in order to neutralize him as a threat, whether he makes it out on the other end of that or not.
Hmm.
And I'm sure Klitschko has his own reason. He's positioning himself for a potential power play, but as they all are. But the question is, it's, and I do think, to return to Zelensky, I have to keep harping on the point that his sacking was vital because there, in my opinion, there is enough of the groundwork for a potential coup or mutiny in Ukraine with the AFU and especially with the more hardliner elements of the Ukrainian nation, but there's no central figure to rally around. And Zelensky
Yeah,
was the really the only person who could have filled that role.
I totally agree.
And like I said, maybe Klitschko is trying to fill that void, but what's the mayor of Kiev going to do against Zelensky?
Right.
At
He
least
he
the head of
might
the
be
armed forces had a chance, but this is nothing.
yeah, he might be rational reasoning that because he's not as extreme as Zelensky and he's an alternative to Zelensky, he might have a chance.
That the Western sponsors will come in and make him
Yeah,
the new
I don't
poster
think the
boy.
Western sponsors are they do not want to give up
Oh no,
on
that's, if we're going back to credibility, legitimacy. Zelensky, who they spent years, even going back to before this war started, building up, him being kicked out of power, especially in a very unceremonious way, is not the image they want for this war. And it even goes back to the issue of continuity of government. Changing government in wartime is not a move that you want to make. And also the same thing with the Russians. While there may be some candidates who have a more hardline position on Ukraine, and you listen to some of them say, well, I would end this conflict faster, that's still not, you don't want to open yourself up to that kind of instability in the middle of the war, especially on the Ukrainian side, especially on the losing side. And I mean, it really is in a position where something has to give, but nothing can give in Ukraine, and it just creates this very impotent state in both the sense of the state apparatus and in the sense of the state of affairs. And I really don't know what the future is because under all logical circumstances, the Ukrainian state should be far more dysfunctional. I mean, not that it isn't dysfunctional, but it should be far more dysfunctional than it is. The fact that it can keep up the basic apparatuses of state function is it defies logic, and
Hmm.
I really can't say I know what the outcome of something like this is going to be because Zelensky, and of course the Russians like Zelensky being in power because he's completely incompetent. They couldn't ask for a better rival in this war.
Yeah.
But yeah, so nobody wants on either side wants to budge on Zelensky. Zelensky certainly doesn't want to budge on Zelensky because he knows the minute he's out, even if he does get his golden parachute, even if he does get his think tank job, it's still going to have the possibility of, I don't know, maybe him getting the Trotsky treatment one day, him getting the ice pick, so to speak, but
Mm.
or something along those lines. And I imagine that despite the fact he's in a war-torn nation, he's probably doing quite well for himself. You see these events that he gets to go to in Germany, these security conferences, these parties they have in Kiev still. He is living to the fullest insofar as his bottom line is concerned. But that, I mean, how much longer can that continue? How much longer until this all bottoms out? Because I would think I could be wrong. Like I said, a lot of this, in my mind at least, maybe I have too narrow a view of this. Defies logic, but I would think that we would have been at the bottoming out point already. Uh, that armies simply cannot endure under these conditions. Do they really fear the, let's just call them what they are, commissars of the Ukrainian government more than they're demoralized? Is that really the only thing keeping them going? Because as we know, as we've seen what the Ukrainians do when they move back in these territories that were held by the Russians, they're merciless when it comes to any sort of fraternization, anything they consider being remotely pro-Russian. That's the closest thing I can think of that they're kept in line by some sort of fear, or maybe they really do genuinely buy in the propaganda that Russia would do this, this, and this if they win, so you have to fight to the last man in order to prevent that from happening, even if it slightly delays it. It's trying to figure out the
Yeah.
logic behind the continuation of this war effort on any level beyond Zelensky's self-interest and, of course, the West pursuing its greater goals in terms of wanting a battering ram. I I don't know what, and I know you, just to clarify, just to stop stumbling around my words here. According to official polling data, Zelensky still actually does have the support of the majority of the country. It's a slim majority. I think it's at like 57% or something like that. But he still does,
Now he does because Zelensky is out, but he
of
was
course.
lower than
Yes,
50% when Zelensky was in.
that that tracks, of course. But the question is, and I think the big question is two questions: is what is the morale of Ukrainian military and society in general, and the second question would be, is there any viable challenger in even in an electoral or non-electoral sense? Will
No, there's not
Zelensky
going to be any
will
elections.
Zelensky return from exile in London in order to stage coup? Who knows? I severely doubt it. I don't think it's going to happen at all.
Remember, even before the SMO, uh, um, Zhirinovsky said that there would be no elections in Ukraine.
And he was correct. But with that being said, I do want to, and I don't want to harp too long on this, but I want to talk a little bit more about the Russian elections. I know I was joking about that a bit at the beginning of the
Yeah.
episode. So I know some people may be wondering, oh, what's the point? Even the most fervent supporters of Russia admit that this election is a mere formality. And we all know that Putin's going to win. But his challengers are um, Kharitonov, who was the Communist Party nominee in 2004. And he performed about how you'd expect. He's a veteran in Russian politics, one of these carryovers in the Soviet era. The economically left but socially nationalist and conservative sort of position that still plays well to the older crowd in Russia. You have Slutsky, who is discount Zhirinovsky, whose his biggest claim to fame is a few misconduct allegations from women, but I mean, take those for what you will. You have after that I believe it's Danikonov is the quote unquote liberal candidate who is actually the deputy speaker of the Duma right now, who was instrumental. I actually figured this out as we were recording in pushing through the transgender laws in Russia that really clamped down on that and that put severe restrictions on the changing of birth certificates and surgery and hormones, which I think is quite funny. That's the liberal candidate, and his position on Ukraine isn't even what the West would want. It's just a ceasefire in order to maintain status quo. So that I mean, even their liberal candidates have been forced to appeal to those positions. Now, we're not going to pretend like Denis Konov, I believe, once again, forgive me, I mispronounced that, is going to win. But it is interesting looking at this. I, out of curiosity, did some brief research last night looking through the margins of victory that has gotten since 2000. In 2000, it was somewhere around 53% with a much stronger opposition. 2004, it was more handily in the 60s. And then, of course, you had Medvedev sent, who was I think he also got in the 60s somewhere. 2012, he comes back with around 73% of the vote. That's the one where they really start to allege fraud and they really start to allege the idea that the elections might not be honest, even though the ones in the 2000s were left unquestioned. You had 2018, of course, the one that Trump made the great transgression of congratulating him for his victory on. And once again, he was in the mid to high 70s around there with whatever I can't even remember the name of the KPRF candidate they put up then, but it's always the same. It in these election cycles, it's Putin on an independent ticket, the Communist Party candidate, and then the LDPR candidate, which is for those who don't know, Zhirinovsky's party, the Liberal
Mhm.
Democratic Party, which is the furthest right party in the country. I love it. I love
The
it.
name.
It's amazing. It's such a troll name, but and then of course you have the liberals and the fringe parties coming in, in distant places there. But I do think in this election in particular, with Russia being at such a pivotal moment, the second place winner of this election will really tell us the direction of the population. Now, like I said, we can count on Putin probably getting, I would say, mid 70s in the official vote count. Now, if you want to believe that statistic is puffed up a bit, fair enough, but I think that's generally around what his approval rating is, and if you're to believe the Polish polling firms about that, I think that's a safe assumption. Then, after that, if we get Hartikonov, the communist candidate, coming back to power, I think that would show probably a turnout from the older Soviet nostalgia voters who aren't quite on board with Putin and just are more on the, like I said, the people who long for the Brezhnev era. And that's going to show that, yeah, they probably had a higher turnout. Um, Slutsky, the LDPR candidate, getting a higher percentage of the vote. Now, his big campaign has been, I'm going to commit more troops and resources to Ukraine, and we're going to have a big arrow movement and win the war. That's his entire platform. Whereas, returning back to Hartikonov, his entire platform is just stuff about economic and agrarian reform. Just very, like I said, appealing to, like I said, the older boomer voters who belong for the Brezhnev era. Then you have the Denikonov voters who liberal support is going to rally around, and despite the fact that even by Russian standards he's not all that liberal, he certainly knows Zelensky replacement. I don't think that he will take the figurehead of opposition in this election. But I do think that if we see better results from the LDPR, that'll show that, yeah, maybe the people want this war to end faster. Maybe they want to commit more resources to the war. Like I said, if we see a communist in second place, that's probably, once again, just the Soviet nostalgia vote coming out in a stronger force. And I don't want to sound alarmist, but if we do see uh, Denikonov, that could suggest something of discontent or an undercurrent because he's the quote unquote real opposition candidate. Like I said, it's not like he's that far off, but still, that's who the opposition are going to air their grievances through. In which case, I wouldn't say it's a cause for concern, but I would say it does show an undercurrent of actual discontent in Russian society. Even though I still think the election's probably going to follow the traditional formula of Putin, communist, LDPR, etc.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, most of the voting is already in. Tomorrow is the last day. I don't think anybody expects Putin to lose, obviously. What people are going to be paying attention to is the margin by which Putin wins. So any downgrade, any less popularity is going to be looked at. Of course, it's also going to be magnified. Um, now, the other thing we should mention, of course, is the Biden administration has condemned international observers, as they always do, for observing any election that happens in Russia or Belarus or any country that is friendly with Russia. They condemn all of them. They don't want any observers there, right? Because there is only one democracy, and it's the kind of democracy that we've enjoyed here on this hemisphere for the last few years, and in Western Europe, right? That's the brand. So yes.
Yeah, and like I said, I think you can expect the usual shenanigans. It doesn't look like the push for maybe it will come after the election, but the push for discontent
Mhm.
and protesters has come like it did in Serbia. Even though it did fizzle out pretty quickly in Serbia, you haven't heard much of that as of late. But I do think with that, you might see a wave of the same liberal back protesters you do at the end of this, and they'll try to drum this up in some sort of color revolution movement that will probably be DOA. And that's really what you can expect from the Russian elections. There's not too much analysis you can put into something like this, but I am curious to see if it does break the traditional formula of the first, second, third placing, because I'm almost certain that it's going to go like that. And it's also worth noting that um, Haratonov is also he's promising escalation with Ukraine and a more aggressive posturing towards the West, but not as much as say like somebody like Slutsky, who's very dedicated to that. We're going to just wipe the floor with Ukraine, which is pretty much his entire platform, just running to the right of that. But it's to be understood that yes, the big three are all in support of the current war to some varying degree, and even the quote unquote liberal dissident isn't that anti-war with Ukraine. That's really what it's been reduced to. Like I said, there literally is no Navalny candidate this time of any note, not one that I could find, but the four people actually made it on the ballot. That's what it was. And like I said,
Mm.
this will be a very open and shut affair in my opinion. But I will be curious to see if the communists can be knocked from their second place pedestal and what we can infer from that, depending on the results. That's really what I'm looking for.
Yeah, maybe to just briefly shift back to Ukraine.
Of course.
There was a Washington Post title that caught my eye today. In this Ukrainian village, almost no men are left.
Oh yes, I saw that too.
You saw that, right? All the men in these villages have been killed, mobilized, or emigrated. Employees of military registration and enlistment offices roamed the nearly empty streets looking for people left behind. Ukraine desperately needs troops, and its forces are weakened by deaths, injuries, and fatigue. Yeah, there's the rotation issue again. They interviewed one guy who said, "Of my squad of 12, only two of us are alive." Now, the question is, why would you want to publish this? Well, I mean, obviously, the reason they want to publish this is because they want to send the signal that things are going really bad in Ukraine, and now that could be things are going really bad, and you better push through that aid package, or things are going pretty bad, and maybe there's not much that can be done for them. Um, I mean, obviously, we've arrived at the point where troops will have to be sent in, and they can't be just Ukrainian troops, right? Um, If Russia had or was able to advance quickly, I don't know, maybe the Europeans would have gone in very soon when there was still enough ammunition and everything. But this slow grind where, the front has been basically unchanged overall for, yeah, I mean, yes, a few cities and towns fell that the Russians have taken. Some of them are very strategic and important. But the main thing that's happened is the attrition, right? And now you have Israel complaining that they don't have enough 155 millimeter shells anymore, and so now there's a kind of a tug between them, right? But between Ukraine and Israel. But the thing is, Johnson, the House Speaker, I mean, he's in a great spot right now. You know, if you want to ignore some of the conspiracy illusions I was making earlier, then basically he's told Biden essentially, um, Ukraine's not going to get the aid. Yes, I know the House would pass it after the Senate passed it, but the Ukraine is not going to get the aid unless you give more funding for the wall. Now that if that happens, of course, Biden is already on thin ice. He's going to lose votes because of Palestine, of Gaza, for sure. Uh, the economy is still not great. It's worse than it was before when we had Trump.
And ultimately, he looks like a very incompetent administrator, which
Yeah,
really, when it comes down to winning the independent voters, it's how's the economy and does the president look competent? Those are
right,
the two things that they care about.
right.
And
So Johnson has got him. He's got him nailed, right? Like he knows that Biden isn't going to budge on this, but Biden has to budge on this. But if he does, he risks losing even more support because now the division between Republican Democrat on the question of immigration and mass migration is far greater than it's ever been.
okay, this is going to sound like a really stupid point, but I do think it's worth bringing up to springboard into a different, uh, just a, a bigger topic here. And that is when it comes to the nonsense of the youth vote, this entire TikTok ban, which don't be fooled.
Yeah, we should talk about
As
that.
much as you may hate it, as much as I hate it, this is not just about TikTok. It goes further,
No, no,
and
no.
even it's gotten to the point where Trump has spoken out against the ban,
Yes.
and he even tried to push through a similar. Now, I think what he tried to push through was trying to force them to sell to an American affiliate, which I think something to that degree was accomplished. I don't know how exactly it
Well,
went,
all the
but
data
like,
is stored in Texas under
yes,
Oracle.
yes.
And Oracle, like Amazon, SpaceX, these are all like tied up with, NASA, Pentagon, Deep State,
All the usual
three-letter
stuff.
agencies. It's deeply, deeply interwoven in that. Now, what they're trying to say is, if we wanted the information about these people that we store in Texas, right, we would have to go to a foreign country to get that. Now, I personally believe they have ways of doing that anyways, right? If they really wanted to.
And I will say with that, it, despite the cooling down of relations between the U.S. and China, American and Chinese business, despite the recent trade war, are still very intertwined. They have
Yeah.
connections. I mean, you hear all the time, rightly so, about Chinese infiltration into American companies. Well, I can tell you it's a two-way street. That we are so far up in each other's corporate worlds. It's fun. Chimerica came about as a term for a reason. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah. And I mean, the main reason why they want to ban TikTok is because, I mean, TikTok has surpassed Facebook and Instagram, and it is the app. And the number one hashtag on TikTok in the tens of millions by far is free Palestine. The next four are also to do with Palestine, with freeing Palestine, Gaza, etc., etc. They are over 100 million in hashtags, right? That is what they want. They want to stop, like Israelis can televise the genocide of the Palestinians, but they cannot afford to have the Americans look at it, right? Ultimately, that's what I think this is
Oh,
really about.
absolutely. And
Yes, you can make the argument about access and all of that. The fact is, every app tracks you. Every app has all your information, anyways. So it, you know,
yeah, it's I mean cybersecurity. There are precautions you can take, but it is effectively dead. I think that's just something that everyone needs to accept. That they got you. Like I said, there's ways you can slow them down. There's ways you can maybe mitigate some of the damage. But if somebody wants you, they got you. If they have the resources, that's really what it comes down to. And I think it is interesting that you brought up that thing about Facebook because look, I think we've all long departed from our libertarian days, but there are some loosely libertarian voices that still make quite a few good points. And one of those is Congressman Thomas Massey from Kentucky, where he gave a 3-minute speech on this saying that you can talk about whatever, you can talk about the moral decay, and look, I agree with you on all of that. That's a given. There's something wrong with our culture, and it's being broadcast on this app. But that's not the point. He said that this is not the anti-TikTok bill. This is the pro-Facebook bill, and I know this is a lot of boilerplate statements as you get out of Congress, but I do think that insofar as everything that is said in the chamber, that's probably the most coherent point I've heard about all of this. Where yes, it is to consolidate social media. It is the fact that they are losing grasp on the narrative, and I mean these are marching orders from a certain league that's against anti-defamation. That's really all this comes
mhm.
down to. They couldn't, like I said, they couldn't care less about some of the more degenerate things being promoted on that, some of the general stupidity being promoted on that, what it might encourage. But the minute it got in the way of Israeli aims, the Anti Defamation League stepped in, the ADL stepped in, and decided to put a stop to it. And like I said, it's created a very strange network of alliances where you do have even like a lot of Trump people, including Trump himself, who are tentatively against the ban. And think about it, Trump's big thing was, oh, tough on China, and even he's coming out against this. And like
Mhm,
now,
mhm.
who knows what his position will look like in 2 weeks and a month. But point being is, it has aligned where you have a large amount of the establishment. Of course, they want to shut this down because fundamentally it comes down to the fact that now more than just youth you lose it, but they're losing grasp on the narrative and the social media sites that they had cracked down on, such as Facebook, anything Zuckerberg owns, Twitter up until Musk's acquisition, and even Musk. Well, I will admit that there has been substantial improvement. Musk could be very easily compromised or be thrown out in some sort of corporate coup, or there's things that they can do to take down Musk if they wanted to. There's
Yeah.
laws, there's regulations they could hit him with. They could hit him with, I don't know, maybe trying to bring the FCC into this. And like I said, if there's a will, there's a way. If they're willing to commit the resources to fight that battle, but that leaves it's some of these, let's just say more, uh, at least in terms more fringe. Now I know TikTok by no means is fringe, but in terms of ownership, in terms of control, this more, let's just say, uncharted waters, completely out of their hands, and they simply can't tolerate that. And look, once again, let's assume they strike this down, it goes through. There's going to be a replacement in 2 days, and yeah, the replacement will probably confer to the ADL, to the regime, to all of that. And of course, people have their minds to entertainment. They'll allow all the stupid stuff, all the stuff that you can rightly complain about that's on TikTok right now. But any of the, let's just say, regime questioning narratives, anything that casts doubt on the current narrative is going to be forbidden. And mind you, a lot of what's being cast on the current narrative, this isn't exactly some far right meeting place. This isn't Telegram. These are people are quite to the left, and especially on the Palestine issue, that is the main divide. That is where the coalition is starting to crack once again. And that leads into Chuck Schumer coming out on, admit all of this, concurrent with all of this, Chuck Schumer coming out and saying, well, it's time for Netanyahu to step down, hold elections. It's time for Netanyahu to get out, along with the U.S. pressure to find some sort of resolution to the Gaza conflict, because, as we'd said before, the U.S. can afford one war or the other. They can't afford both. And in terms of optics, it looks worse to support Israel than it does Ukraine, especially with the left-wing voters, especially with Biden going into re-election. That's something that they don't want to do. That's something that they want to scrub from their record. And I mean, Chuck Schumer, of all people, came out. Now, mind you, Schumer has been probably the most blatantly two-faced politician when it comes to his standards on American Israel, where he goes and to right-wing events in Israel and supports these right-wing parties. And I don't know, maybe he's pushing for somebody to the right of Netanyahu. Either way, but I do think it ultimately comes down to the fact that Netanyahu has become bad optics, Likud has become bad optics, and we need to put a bow on this before the election. And hopefully, the electorate will forget about that. We can make them focus on how terrible Trump is and drum up all the same nonsense we did in 2016, 2020, and also talk about the threat of Russia and why we must support Ukraine. Just trying to divert attention away from Israel it, as much as they can. And look, it might just be a bubble, but it's something that people talk about every day. It's something that you see the footage from every day. And how much the average people see of that, I don't know. But especially on Twitter, as you said, I imagine on TikTok. Now I don't know what they're. I've never made an account there. I never will. Even in this very sort of I guess you could say unholy alliance that we've found that some have found ourselves in, and I would say even that extends to Trump to some degree. But like I said, that's not going to make me like them. But I don't know what their content policy is, how much they can get away with showing. Because I know Twitter, it really anything you can see the worst in terms of war footage on there. It's actually, I mean, even before Musk, that was largely the case too. But I do think that moving into this, because this all of course ties back to Israel, because of course it does. That ultimately they're trying to put a neat bow on this. They're trying to sweep this all under the rug, and social media crackdown comes with that. And if you do read into the text of the bill, it's nowhere near as bad as the Restrict Act that they proposed last year. That, thank God, has not moved at all. Where they were going to crack down on you and hold you responsible for using a VPN to access "quote unquote" forbidden sites. That's the action from last year, not this year. But if you read into the text of the bill, of course it's intentionally vague. But it does bring up the question of, well, can they do this to Twitter? Can they do this to Telegram? Can they do this to other hubs where anti-regime narratives may or may not spread? Because, like I said, they got Facebook. They have Zuckerberg's entire operation brought completely under their control. That's no concern. But it looks like they're pushing to do that to the rest of social media. And will they succeed? I don't know. It looks like it's actually going to be a very heated debate in the Senate. Fortunately, like I said, there are some more reasonable people who, say for example, Rand Paul, take what you will about the libertarianism, but a lot of things he's right on, and this is one of them once again. And I know I keep bringing it up, but I do think it is actually a very good thing that Trump has come out against this, even if it is just for the sake of being anti-Biden, that he has made his position clear on this, because I do think that will stymie the process in the Senate, and maybe it will just never move. And rather than being struck down, maybe it will just never move. But if this is
Mm-hmm.
something that can just be kicked back and forth for a while, I think that's good. And like I said, I never thought I'd find myself on the same side as TikTok, but I hope this does not pass, and I hope that they're actually not able to sweep the Israel situation under the rug, and that they have to eat the consequence of their action against their own coalition, because that would just be delightful on election day.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you had any further thoughts on that, or if you want me to go on to spurg about Boeing and aircraft, because I'm
Yeah,
only here for.
let's do that.
Okay, so this is a bit more on the domestic side, but I do think it does play generally into what we have here. This is probably what I'm going to close the show out with, because I am running up on a bit of a time limit. So I'll try to explain this as best as I can. Boeing has had a very bad year so far, even stretching a little bit back into last year. So this actually starts. I'll give you brief personal information here. I love aircraft. I always have. I want to be a pilot, and hopefully that's coming sooner than later. But I won't give away too many details on that. And I've always more or less kept up the aviation industry and know people who know even more than I do about this. Not that I'm some great genius about this. So uh, I'll keep my sources confidential as any good journalist. Uh, redact me if I ever call myself that again, but that's aside the point. Was talking to one of my anonymous sources who knows a lot about aircraft. It's somebody who's probably even more obsessed than I am. And actually, for a number of years, he's been warning me about the 737 MAX, which is one of Boeing's new smaller airliners. Now, this is primarily used for what would be on domestic flights. And once again, was going through all the issues in terms of control and the manuals and the fact that these things are liable to start crashing and falling out of the air. Well, lo and behold, you have a bunch of problems with the 737 Maxes, and a lot of countries actually start to ground their fleets. And I mean, this doesn't only extend to civil aviation. Lest we get into the problem of the F-35 fighter, which I'm certainly willing to do, just not right now. But you see this happen at Boeing again, except it starts affecting the standard bearers of the fleet. So you think your 747s, your 767s, you have landing gear falling off, you have engines catching on fire, you have fuel spilling out on takeoff. So many flights have had to been landed. I've lost track of how many aviation incidents Boeing has had in just the past 6 months, and it's getting ridiculous. And mind you that, but I think since 2016 at least, Boeing has been losing out to Airbus time after time in terms of market share, at least in the United States. And that Airbus has, like I said, they've been dominating Boeing in pretty much every major aviation field. And I will say personally, from what I know of that aircraft, you want to take my word for it. If you're scheduling a flight, do whatever you can to make sure it's on an Airbus. Frankly, I mean, even an Embraer wouldn't be bad because they're the distant third when it comes to major aviation manufacturing. And I don't know, they might see a little bit of a boost from this. But after all of these issues with quality control at Boeing, with and how could I forget the Alaska Airlines flight that had the door rip off 20 minutes into flight? That's
Oh yeah,
that's
yeah,
what
yeah.
brought this to the public's attention. Because
That and there was also an Al Jazeera special. They went undercover and interviewed like the people who work at Boeing, and some of them like said, I would never fly on one of these planes, or there are people who are high on the job who are working here. So crazy stuff like that.
and that's not even getting to the competency crisis with the pilots themselves and the air traffic controllers, but just getting down to the basic structure of the aircraft. After all of this, you have a whistleblower coming out exposing all the problems at Boeing for the past few years. And if you recall, I believe that there was a Netflix documentary around 2018, 2019 that was also tearing into Boeing, and I think that was actually over some instances with the Ethiopian Airlines using the 737s, and a lot of people at the time, understandably so, contributed that to user error on part of the pilots. But I mean, the 737 as an aircraft, like I said, I do not trust the thing, and I've gone to just not trusting Boeing aircraft at all. And so you have this whistleblower come out, and then around the same time, whether it's coincidental, whether it's on purpose, you have United Airlines cancels their order for the 10 737 Maxes that they had placed. And once again, we're talking civilian airliners. These things cost hundreds of millions of dollars. This is monumental business. That's a monumental loss. And I mean, these companies, they still bring in quite a bit of money, but that's when you lose the confidence of one of the major airlines of not only the United States but the world. It it causes some concern. But then you have this whistleblower who comes out having all the secrets on this, and of course, as he says, he's coming out that I have a will to live. I want to see this through. I have no intention of offing myself. And lo and behold, his death comes out, and it's ruled that he took his own life. Now, whether you believe that or not, I don't. I think this is probably even more obvious than Epstein. As you said, Epstein was a real pioneer in this field, frankly. But this is the probably the most blatant uh, elimination of a whistleblower. I've seen, and this is on a corporate level. This isn't even on a government level. This is on a corporate level. Now I know that they're all in bed with each other. That Boeing is, of course, well into the MIC. All of that. You don't need to tell me that. But on top of all the other parts of American industry and manufacturing and engineering that are falling apart, you can add aircraft to the list, and a lot of people will rightfully so go on about the DEI, about the quote unquote wokeness, and like I said, that those are all very valid points here, and I do think that it is a large part to blame for what is happening right now. But you do have to wonder if there's something deeper at hand here, and in my opinion, at least logic would dictate that Airbus, a European company, correct me, I know it's at least French, but I believe it's a French-German venture that it's one of these joint European projects, much like their military aircraft, has outclassed and outsold Boeing for a better part of a decade now. And you would assume, in all logic, you would have Airbuses falling out of the sky. You would have these things falling apart at the seams. But no, it's Boeing, the American alternative. And this
Mhm.
probably has to be the only major industry in the world I can think of at this point in 2024 that outcompete where the Europeans outcompete the Americans. Since 2008, fortunes have been completely reversed, and aviation does seem to be the only area where that continues to be the case. And like I said, I would understand if this were the other way around because the Americans are trying to take the European competition down a peg. I don't think it's the other way. I don't think it's the Airbus is trying to sabotage Boeing or the French are trying to sabotage the Americans or anything like that. I think it's a little bit far. I think it's even a little far fetched in the other case. But point being is they already dominate them in the market. There's no reason to push that further. And I suppose you could say this is to scare people off of flying and trying to make them stay and get into some of the other agendas along those lines, trying to make them stay put and quarantines, control travel. 2020 opened up a lot of doors that once seemed unreasonable and made them seem very plausible. So there is that, but I mean, ultimately, I think it just boils down to a complete loss of competence by major American industry and government. And
Mhm.
this is all very rich in light of, at the beginning of the war, you recall, in March 2022, April 2022, the insistence that the Russian civil aviation industry would collapse, that Russian military aviation would
Yeah,
completely
yeah.
collapse, from the country that gives us the 737 and the F-35.
Right, right, right. Good point. Not to build a case against you, but this
Oh,
reminded
please
me
do.
that there was an Ilyushin 76. 15 people died. Um, it was not shot down by Ukrainians. So birds got into the engines. One of the engines caught fire, and there's a video of it. The engine just falls off. These planes have four engines, and the pilot, I guess, tried to land, but it didn't work, which is kind of funny because DiCaprio remembers being in this plane with an engine catching fire as well several years ago. But yes, you're right. This is something that is usually associated with Russian aviation, and it's constantly ridiculed or whatever. But there are serious issues that you're bringing up, obviously. The name of the deceased, the witness for this court case against Boeing, he did have his name is John Barnett. He worked 32 years for Boeing, retired in 2017. And as you mentioned earlier, but it was a female friend of his that besides others, but particularly there was a female friend of his that tweeted that he told me he had no intention of killing himself, and he was scheduled to again give more testimony.
And I am, I don't want to say curious because that implies a bit more benevolence in the situation, but I am uh, interested, I suppose, be a more neutral word that'd be more appropriate for this, to see what comes of this, what comes of Boeing, what damage control be, because it seems like Boeing has just been ignoring the issue no PR statements. They're just pretending like this doesn't happen. When you day after day get more stories, even slipping into the mainstream of Boeing aircraft that are woefully inadequate, and it does also make you wonder how much deeper it gets into this when, well, at the airport, who's doing these pre-flight inspections? Who is making sure these aircraft are airworthy? And how deep does this problem go? Is it simply a problem of Boeing manufacturing, which I do agree is a major problem, but how much does this go to the competency of pilots, the competency of air traffic control, the competency of airport staff, the safety crews who make sure these things, once again, are even fit to fly in the first place? And I mean, the reason I bring this up is we talk about what happens with American industry, with American government, and just the decline in just, once again, general competence is really the only word you can put to it, and how much further this will go, and really just to document this. And flying, which is, I mean, even despite these scandals, is still the safest form of travel. Don't be fooled by that. Now, who knows how long it will stay that way? But when some of the most basic forms of transportation start to fall apart, it it starts to raise concern. Like you're not used to hearing these stories of first world countries. Like I said, when you go back to 2019 when they made that documentary, you hear this out of Ethiopia. You're not happy about it, but it's to be expected. You hear this
Mm.
out of other countries like that. You're not happy about it, but it's to be expected. Of course, for years they've been saying that about Russian aviation, and I don't know. They might relish a little bit in that. Far be it from me to make those assumptions, but I do have to wonder with that how much this will bleed over into American industry and business in general. How what the ramifications of this will be, how much damage control they'll do, and how much more of this they try to shove down our throats. And I don't know. Maybe this is some Airbus conspiracy to dominate the market, or maybe they're trying to make air travel just inaccessible to the average person for a number of different reasons. But you can speculate a lot about all of this. But like I said, I want to bring this up. I would have ignored the issue, maybe brought up in passing, had it not been for this whistleblower and had it not been for United canceling its orders. But I do think in the business world, at least, which I do like to cover from time to time on the show, is certainly relevant. We're going to start seeing seismic shifts. Now, those certainly won't be overnight, but what the consequences of those will be, I'm just going to say outright, while you can't be certain, they're going to try to spin this to disadvantage you and I in some way.
Hmm. Hmm.
And albeit that was brief, that didn't have much to say on the aviation industry. If you have any last minute stories you want to throw in to round out the show, if you have anything that we may have missed.
Yeah, I sent you a photo of that guy Volkov who was hit with a hammer in Lithuania. He was Navalny's, I don't know, supporter or friend. It also turns out he's a tribe member. That's interesting. But there's
I
also
would have
kind
never
of like a,
guessed.
but there's also a kind of an interesting story about the author of the now decriminalized law 828, um, Boris Spiegel. So Boris Spiegel was head of the World Congress of Russian-speaking Jewry. He was caught in bribery. He's been sentenced to 11 years. He's going to a strict prison. And he's also been fined 400 million rubles, and all his awards have been stripped. Um, and the last bit of interesting news is Vyacheslav Adamenko, an Israeli volunteer who actually has been fighting in Ukraine. Obviously, he's like part Ukrainian ancestry, part Jewish ancestry. He was eliminated this week. And 2 weeks ago, an American Humper Vickery, not Jewish, Hamas killed him as well. He had gone there as a volunteer to fight. The Russians did release this week stats on foreign mercenary losses and who leads the pack and all that. This is their official word on it. I'm just trying to find it. You know what? I'm just going to go to. I think I saved it in my pictures. Ah, yes, here they are. So Poland leads the way with 2,960 volunteers, 1,497 dead. Britain, 822 volunteers, 360 dead. Romania, 784 volunteers, 349 dead. Croatia,
And these are just the
330.
official numbers.
Yes, 335 volunteers, 152 dead. What are some other interesting ones? USA, 1,113 volunteers, 491 dead. Canada, 1,005 volunteers, 422 dead. And of course, Colombia's been in the news with all these mercenaries. 430 volunteers, um, 217 dead. Let's see, Georgia, 1,042 volunteers, 561 dead, and there's other ones, of less significant numbers, of course. Albanians. The other bit of news, of course, bombing of Damascus at the moment. Russian out now near the Golan Heights with the SAA. The Russians did struck a huge number of um, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham militants. This is basically like Al Qaeda in Syria and Idlib, and 60 dead, including Albanians. Surprised the Albanians even go over here to Syria to fight.
Is it not jihad?
It certainly is. Oh, France also 356 volunteers, 147 dead. Latvia 95 dead, Germany 88 dead. So it's interesting. All these you know these nations with the highest numbers. So overall, there were 24,000 that arrived. Um, cables, communication cables, have been cut around various locales of African nations. Obviously, the Houthis aren't doing this; it's beyond their capabilities. Now, they did cut some in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, but this is far closer to home. They're shallower waters. Um, in any case, let's see. Is there any other than that I have leftovers?
A NATO
Probably, but I don't
delegation
remember
is
them.
a NATO delegation is paying a visit to Armenia on
That's right.
this week.
Jens Stoltenberg is going. Yeah.
So, and that's after Armenia has continued to distance itself from the CSTO and has made statements against Russia and its current alignment in general. So, who knows what the future holds for Armenia, what the exact goal here. I don't know, maybe Armenia is yet another NATO member, which I'm sure won't create any tension with Turkey and the issue with Azerbaijan. But who knows what they have in the way, and maybe Pashinyan will get his dream of rebuilding the Transcaucasian Soviet Republic. Who knows? Because that's the only thing that makes sense out of that man. But that's all I had for this week. Thank you, everyone, once again for tuning in. We will be back next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.